Hello, everyone. Today, it's a pleasure to have Andrew Ilyas, who is a PhD student at MIT, working with Costis, Daskalakis, and Aleksander Madry. And his research focuses in quantifying and improving the robustness of machine learning systems. And he, together with his group, have done a lot of great work on studying adversarial attacks and looking at how these can serve as good ways for learning better representations. Andrew did his undergraduate and master's of engineering at MIT, double majoring in computer science and math. And he has worked at the MIT Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, the database lab at MIT, and as a research intern at 2 Sigma Labs. He is currently supported by an Open Philanthropy Fellowship. And that's it. We're very excited to hear about your research, Andrew.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction. With Jacob Steinhardt from Berkeley and our advisor, Aleksander Madry. Okay, cool. Okay, so just to give a brief outline of what I'll be talking about, I'm going to start by spending actually a decent amount of time motivating the phenomenon we're studying, which is this approach or this technique called dataset replication, which has recently gained popularity in machine learning. So I'll actually spend a decent amount of time just introducing what that is and motivating it and putting our work into context. Then, I guess as the title of the presentation might suggest, spend time how we can identify sort of hypothetically and then experimentally confirm sources of bias in dataset replication. And the exact nature of that bias, I guess we'll talk about when we get to it. We'll then explore techniques for actually accounting for this bias in the results stage of dataset replication studies. And I'll probably, just for time constraints, only talk about one technique for doing so. And then we'll just kind of wrap up with takeaways and future work in this area. Cool. So just to start with, a very brief overview of what we'll call like the supervised machine learning paradigm, where basically progress is driven by the fact that we have these like absolutely massive training sets that consist of inputs and their corresponding labels. And then we as researchers take in these training sets, we develop like our learning algorithms or whatever, and the output of this process is usually a model. And the purpose of this model is to take in new inputs and predict the corresponding outputs. And the way we measure progress in this field is basically through some held out data that we've never seen before. We'll call it like a test set T. This test set T contains unseen images by the model and their corresponding labels, and we'll basically test the model by seeing how well it does on this test data. And if it does really well, it establishes a new state of the art and everyone's super happy. So in isolation, this paradigm is kind of foolproof and works really well. But what recent works have started to pick up on, and even not recent works, it goes back to, I guess, like the last century, is that this paradigm is not really done in isolation. In fact, there are a bunch of researchers and a bunch of models that are all evaluating their model on the same exact test data T. And so the danger that arises here is that as time goes on, we might no longer be kind of selecting for models that do really well on the underlying like computer vision task, but instead do well on like this test set T for no real like deep algorithmic reason. And so a driver of progress recently has been this question of like, with everyone working on the same test data, how do we know that we're actually making progress? And a lot of kind of works over the past years have cared about this question. We're going to focus on kind of two aspects of it in particular. So the first aspect is we want to make sure that the models we develop are not overfitting to like finite sample test data. So you can think of like there's like this giant research community. We're all testing on however many images. Every time we evaluate one of our models, there's some amount of noise in the process of evaluating them. And so we want to make sure that when we say model A is better than model B, it's actually the case that like the algorithm used to generate model A is better than the corresponding algorithm for model B, and not that just like due to finite sample error, model A is better than model B. And you can imagine if this process takes place over like many years, you might end up just super like selecting models that just happen to do really well on like the couple of images that you chose rather than actually generalizing to the distribution. The second related problem is we want to make sure that models are not unreasonably sensitive to the data creation pipeline. And what this means is that kind of a side effect of using one test set is that that one test set was generated like at one point in time by one group of researchers or students or whatever, or labelers. And so a lot of these factors that you really don't want to affect model accuracy, like the exact date and time in which the data set was made, or the exact labelers used to label the data set, or any of these factors, you don't want those to have a big effect on models' accuracy on this data set. And so recent works have basically, to tackle these problems, have basically taken on the view of, okay, let's think of a data set as an experiment, like a biology experiment or a chemistry experiment. So like the equipment used to run the experiment is exactly the labelers and the date and time and the data source and all of that stuff. And then the result of the experiment is just this like finite set of images that we're going to use as our test set. So under this view, these problems 1 and 2 kind of have a natural interpretation. So we can think of basically the p-hacking phenomenon in like the natural sciences, where you generate like your experiment has some finite power, and if you test too many hypotheses on the same exact experiment, you're going to end up like concluding that some hypotheses are correct when they're actually false, and you're just like overusing your finite sample. Similarly, the problem 2 corresponds to kind of a lack of experimental reproducibility. So what that means is that like even though one person with one set of tools was able to run the experiment, me with my own very similar set of tools is not able to run the experiment. And so under this kind of experimental view, a very natural approach to diagnosing these 2 problems is to just try reproducing the experiment ourselves. And this is exactly the view taken on by a lot of recent data replication works in machine learning, is to basically say, okay, I'm going to treat my data set like an experiment, and then I'm just going to try to reproduce the experiment. And what this corresponds to is basically, here was our supervised learning paradigm that we had before. Basically, we're going to throw away the original test data, and we're going to draw a new set of images, let's say T2, from the same distribution, but now using our own equipment and labelers and all of that stuff. And we're going to measure what progress has looked like on T2. Okay, so hopefully everything has made sense so far. And yeah, again, as always, like feel free to unmute yourself and shout a question or add one to the chat or anything like that. Okay, so a crucial question here is how exactly are we supposed to sample this new T2? So it'd be great if like there had been some magical test set that we've held out for like the last 15 years for all of the machine learning data sets, and we could just use that. But the reality is that we have to find new images that we can use and call like sampled from the same distribution as the original test set. And in short, the problem here is that we usually know vaguely how a data set is constructed. Like for example, the original data set paper might say like we scrape a bunch of images from Flickr and then we run quality control on it. And like the exact nature of the quality control isn't super clear or something like that. We don't usually have sufficient details to like fully reproduce the data set. And we'll look at a case study in the next slides that really illustrate this point. So a natural like best effort approach to sampling this new test set T2 is to basically replicate the data pipeline as closely as we can. And then where we can't replicate the pipeline exactly, we'll just try to ensure that the resulting test set like whatever new test set we're making, matches the original one with respect to some relevant metric that we think kind of should serve the same purpose. And again, if this is like too abstract or not clear, we'll give a very concrete example of it on the next slide. So as a case study, we're going to look at a recent replication study known as ImageNet-v2. This was directed all last year. And the purpose of this replication study was exactly to come up with a new test set for ImageNet, or one of the purposes was to come up with a new test set for ImageNet that matched the original test set distribution. So ImageNet, of course, is like one of the most popular data sets in computer vision, and the like corresponding ILS RVC or something like that challenges are like a pretty big driver of progress. So it's a very natural data set to want to replicate. So the pipeline that actually generated the original ImageNet, so this is like from the original ImageNet paper, is kind of a scrape and filter pipeline, like the one I was describing earlier. So the ImageNet authors go to a bunch of like these image hosting sites. Through a bunch of targeted queries, they basically scrape what are called candidate images and their corresponding candidate labels. So they have like, they go to like Flickr, for example, they search dog, they take all of those images, or they search like terrier, they take all of those images and then they present them with the candidate label terrier. So now, obviously, if you just go search all of these crazy image websites for things, you're going to end up with a very, very dirty, large portion mislabeled data set. So for quality control, the authors basically upload these candidate labels and candidate images to Mechanical Turk and ask workers, like, does this candidate label correspond to this candidate image? So in this like overly simplified example here, we have a picture of a dog and the worker is asked, like, is this a dog? And then each like candidate label, candidate image pair is shown to a bunch of annotators. And the original ImageNet authors basically say that an image is included into the ImageNet test set if what they call a convincing majority of annotators say that yes, the corresponding, the candidate image corresponds to the candidate label, or the image is labeled correctly. Okay, so how should one go about replicating ImageNet? How should one go about making a new test set? Well, a reasonable way to start is by going by basically replicating the pipeline as close as we can. So maybe we'll scrape some image hosting websites for candidate images and candidate labels in the same way that the original authors did. And then we'll upload them to Mechanical Turk for quality control. But here's where we reach kind of this this problem that we discussed earlier, where it's kind of unclear what to do now, because we don't have the exact definition of what a convincing majority is, and we want to match the ImageNet test set as closely as we can. And so instead of trying to exactly replicate the author's filtering pipeline, the ImageNet author's filtering pipeline, a reasonable thing to do is to say, okay, I don't have access to the original filtering method, but I know what I want. I want to make sure that the ImageNet-v2 images are as high quality a data set as the original kind of ImageNet-v1 data set. That is, the images have kind of similar difficulty to these Mechanical Turk workers. And so a relevant metric here that Rector will define is something called selection frequency. And this is a very simple metric that basically says, for a given candidate image and candidate label, it's the rate at which Mechanical Turk workers say that, yes, this image is labeled correctly. Yeah, I guess mathematically, it's just the number of yeses that you get from this question here that says it's a dog over the number of total annotators that you asked. And so although this doesn't correspond perfectly to like what the human accuracy is, because it's notoriously hard to measure, images with like a very high selection frequency are likely to be like very unambiguously correctly labeled, whereas images with low selection frequency are expected to be harder or even mislabeled. And so as an example of this, here's a random class throne. So this is our candidate label. And so an image with selection frequency 36% for the class throne might look like this. It's a dog on a chair. It's kind of unclear if the chair is a throne or not. Also, there's a giant dog in the middle. Something with higher selection frequency might look like this, where the image is maybe less ambiguous and maybe a throne, so 61%. And then something with 100% selection frequency looks like this. So it's like very unambiguously a throne. It's in a museum. Like there's very little argument as to whether or not that's a throne. And so the selection frequency seems like a very kind of natural metric along which to match the ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 datasets. So just to reiterate, intuitively, instead of trying to figure out what a convincing majority is, we're just going to measure the ratio of workers that label the image as yes, and we're going to try to make this equal between the ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 datasets. Okay, so just to like kind of put everything together, the full replication pipeline used by Recht et al. Looks something like this. We'll scrape Flickr for candidate images and candidate labels and upload these candidate images and candidate labels to Mechanical Turk. Using this Mechanical Turk experiment, we will calculate selection frequencies, which is the number of workers that say, yes, this is correctly labeled over the total number of workers. To have a baseline for comparison, we're also going to mix in images from the original ImageNet test set. And so the output of this experiment is basically selection frequencies for both all of these new Flickr images that we got, which are completely disjoint from the original test set, and selection frequencies for the original test set. And so this is what it looks like. For the original test set, what we're going to do is we're just going to make a histogram of the selection frequencies. So I have an example histogram here at like the bottom of my screen. All we're going to do is just like on the x-axis are selection frequency ranges. So like the leftmost bar corresponds to images with selection frequency between 0 and 0.2. And the y-axis corresponds to like the fraction of the data set composed of images with that selection frequency. So the histogram at the very bottom basically says that like 10% of the images in the original ImageNet test set have selection frequency between 0 and 0.2. And we're going to repeat the same process for the Flickr images. We're basically going to bin them by what their selection frequency is. Okay, I'm going to take this histogram at the bottom. And I'm basically going to multiply each bar by how big I want my V2 data set to be, which is called the target data set size. So for example, if I have, if I want a ImageNet V2 data set of size like 1,000, I'm going to multiply each of these bars by 1,000 and basically end up with this histogram on the right. This histogram on the right tells me basically in my new data set, how many images should have each selection frequency. Okay. Lastly, I'm just going to use this histogram on the right here from my original test set to sample from my histogram on the left. So as an example, I'm going to look at the leftmost bin here, and it says that I should have 100 images in my new data set that have selection frequency between 0 and 0.2. And so I'm going to go to the same leftmost bucket in my histogram of Flickr images, and I'm just going to sample 100 images from there at random. And the result is going to be a final data set where the actual images are completely new disjoint images from Flickr, but the distribution of selection frequencies is going to be according to the distribution in the V1 data set. Okay. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And again, feel free to like ask me anything if it didn't. Okay, so what conclusions can we actually draw, or what conclusions do Recht et al. Draw from this replication study? So they collect this final data set, they evaluate a bunch of ImageNet models on it, and then what they plot is essentially on the x-axis, we're going to make a scatter plot, and each dot in the scatter plot is going to be a different model. And on the x-axis of the scatter plot is going to be the model's original ImageNet-v1 accuracy, so what it gets on ImageNet. And on the y-axis, the y-coordinate of each point is going to be its accuracy on this new constructed V2 data set that should match the original in terms of image difficulty. Okay, and what we find is a curve like this. So here, I've added a dotted line that's basically the line y equals x on this graph, which says like, okay, if we believe that ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 are just the same distribution, then models that are kind of like perfectly robust or not overfit, or like the models that we actually want are on this y equals x line. It turns out that the models that we actually get are this blue line, or like more precisely the blue dots. And so concretely, we find Rect et al. Draw kind of two major observations from this graph. The first of these is that they observe that the slope, or like the fit of these points, is very linear, and it has a slope of like that's bounded away from 1. So what this means is that for every 1% of accuracy that you get on ImageNet-v1, you get 1% or more of accuracy on ImageNet-v2. And so the claim is that this should kind of maybe reduce our fears a bit of adaptive overfitting as a problem, because if adaptive overfitting were a real problem, then we would expect like improvements on ImageNet to yield diminishing returns on ImageNet-v2. The second observation, which is the one we'll kind of focus on, is they note a really large accuracy drop between ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2, and specifically between like 11 and 14%, which is, again, really significant for a data set with 1,000 classes. So they note this like 11 to 14% accuracy drop across models, and this seems to be like very consistent across like random feature models and all of the deep learning models that they tested. And so kind of at first glance, this drop is super unexpected, because like we specifically designed ImageNet-v2 to kind of have the same difficulty as ImageNet-v1. So maybe while we might expect like, if adaptive overfitting was the case, we might expect like, I don't know, like a weird slope on the line or diminishing returns or something, this accuracy drop might indicate that like our second fear about models being overly brittle to kind of insignificant properties of the data distribution might actually have some merit. It might be a real thing to be worried about. But we're going to ask like a much more natural question, or a much more like a different question. I guess we don't know if it's natural yet, which is, what if the selection frequencies between these data sets don't actually match? So recall I just went over and spent a ton of time talking about this long image pipeline that's designed to match the selection frequencies. But just to be sure, can we make sure that the selection frequencies between ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 actually match? Okay, so now is the part when I finally start talking about experiments that we did. And so the first experiment that we did is just really simply remeasuring ImageNet-v2 selection frequencies. So what this means is that we took the original test set and the new test set generated by Rect et al., and we just uploaded the images again to Mechanical Turk and asked workers the same kind of selection frequency experiment. So we show workers the images, we ask them whether or not the image corresponds to the label, and we calculate the selection frequency as like the rate at which workers accept the image as corresponding to the candidate label. And just for the sake of complete correctness here, like the interface that I have here at the bottom of the slide is not the actual interface that we use for asking these workers. It's just a simplification to illustrate what the selection frequency really is. Okay, great. So here I'm going to plot the results of our first experiment. So on the x-axis, I have what the selection frequency is. So we use 40 workers for each, 40 annotators for each image in both ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2. And then on the y-axis, we have basically the number of images in each data set that corresponds to the selection frequency on the x-axis. So it's just going to be a simple histogram of the selection frequencies. Oh, okay. Fine. Okay. What we find is that despite being designed to match the selection frequencies, we find that the selection frequencies of ImageNet-v1 are actually skewed much more towards higher selection frequencies than that of ImageNet-v2. So in our experiment, we noted about a 4% difference in the average selection frequency, but you can really see the difference kind of in this histogram. Yeah, so again, we see a very significant gap that we obviously probably wouldn't expect between the V1 and V2 selection frequencies. Okay, so why might this gap between the ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 selection frequencies exist? A first guess might be that there are like experimental differences between the original ImageNet experiment that like people at Princeton, I guess, did tons of years ago, and the Rect et al. Experiment and our experiment, and they're very hard to compare. But it turns out, as we'll find out later, that we can actually kind of isolate this exact same phenomenon of there being a gap after explicitly trying to match them, even staying within our own data. So if we use only our own data and then basically try to simulate the matching process with some of it and then measure the gap with other parts of it, we can show that like this gap will still occur. And so this points to kind of a much more nuanced reason for why this gap exists, which is statistical bias. And so I will spend most of the rest of the talk discussing like how the statistical bias actually arises, what it is, and how we might account for it both in the ImageNet-v2 replication study and in dataset replication studies in general. Okay, so just again, recalling from a couple of slides ago, the goal of the original ImageNet-v2 pipeline was to match the selection frequency distributions between the original ImageNet-v1 and the new ImageNet-v2. And the way we did this was by basically measuring selection frequencies and then doing this like histogram matching process. Now, the nuance here is that we never actually are able to measure for any image the true selection frequency. So you can imagine like for every image has like some true selection frequency that's like really the probability given a random mechanical Turk worker that this mechanical Turk worker will like label the image as corresponding to the label. And that selection frequency might be like, can have like arbitrary granularity. What we measure instead is like an average over, let's say like 10 or 20 or 40 workers of whether or not a worker said that the candidate label corresponded to the candidate image. And so the fewer workers that I use to estimate the selection frequency, the more noisy my reading of the selection frequency is. So you can imagine like if I repeat the same experiment, an image with selection frequency like 0.5, if I repeat the experiment, but I only use like 3 workers, then some of the time I'm going to measure the selection frequency as like 1 out of 3. Sometimes it's going to be 2 out of 3. I'm never going to actually read the selection frequency of 0.5. And generally, the noise is only going to disappear, like this S hat X, which is our noisy estimate, is only going to be the true S when I use infinite workers, which is obviously not possible. Okay, so how does this nuance affect the actual data set replication process? So let's take a step back for a second and pretend that I have like access to the actual distributions of both Flickr images and ImageNet images. Obviously, this is like a ridiculous assumption, but for now, we're just pretending that we have access to these distributions. And now what I've plotted here on the left is essentially the distribution of selection frequencies, of true selection frequencies for both of these data sets. So for example, the blue line corresponds to like the density of the process of draw a random ImageNet image, look at its true selection frequency and plot it. And the orange line corresponds to the same for Flickr. Okay, now let's say, pretending that I knew these. Let's say I uploaded an image to Mechanical Turk, and Mechanical Turk tells me that it has a selection frequency of 7 out of 10. So we showed 10 workers this image, and 7 of the annotators said, yes, this dog is actually a dog. So if this is the case, then what should my belief be about what the true selection frequency is of that image? I guess the key insight, and like, please stop me if this doesn't make sense because the rest of the talk is going to build on this. The key insight here is that what I believe about the true selection frequency actually depends on where I got the image from. So under this kind of hypothetical example where I knew both like the ImageNet-v1 and the Flickr selection frequency distributions, if I observe a selection frequency of 7 out of 10, if I'm looking at an ImageNet image, then sure, like a priori, there's like an equal chance of overestimating and underestimating the selection frequency. But I know that way more ImageNet images have high selection frequencies than low selection frequencies. So in fact, there's a much higher chance that I had a high selection frequency and underestimated it than the fact that I had a lower selection frequency and overestimated it. And so concretely, my belief about what the actual true selection frequency is somewhere above 0.7, just because most of the mass in my ImageNet distribution lies way above 0.7. Similarly, for Flickr, I look at Flickr and I say, okay, there's like, given some true selection frequency S, there was an equal chance of overestimating it and underestimating it. But since I know that way more Flickr images have low selection frequencies, there's a much higher chance that I am overestimating the selection frequency through this noisy sample than the chance that I'm underestimating it, because there's a way higher chance that the image itself has a low selection frequency. And so this is like, obviously, I mean, you can see this like mathematically just through applying Bayes' rule and looking at the difference in the posteriors, but even intuitively, it kind of becomes clear once you think about knowing this P1 and P Flickr on the left here, it becomes clear that like the true selection frequency after reading an observed selection frequency actually depends on where I got this image from. And so the implications of this for actual data set replication is that I know that ImageNet on average should have a higher selection frequency than Flickr, just because ImageNet itself was sourced from Flickr and then filtered. And so this like view, obviously completely hypothetical, might not be completely inaccurate in the sense of like, for a given selection frequency, I might expect Flickr images to have lower true selection frequencies and ImageNet-v1 images to have higher true selection frequencies. Okay. If this like kind of update rule version doesn't convince some people, another way we can look at it, so just to sum this up. So even though the estimated selection frequency S hat is like unbiased given this true selection frequency S, what I actually think the selection frequency should be given a reading is not actually just the reading. It depends on the prior distribution. Okay, so if this kind of like prior update view doesn't convince you, an alternate way to look at this, and if it did convince you, then you can ignore this. But if it didn't convince you, an alternate way to look at this is by thinking about matching distributions. So imagine here the, just as in the last slide, imagine here the red function corresponds to the ImageNet-v1 distribution, and the black function corresponds to the Flickr selection frequency distribution. If that's the case, then the dotted line, so the dotted black and dotted red line respectively, will correspond to the distribution of observed selection frequencies. So obviously it's going to be like more dispersed than the actual true selection frequencies, because I'm observing these like noisy versions. And so you can think of the process as I'm trying to match the red line, the red solid line and the black solid line, but I'm doing it using samples from the black dotted line and the red dotted line. And so I'm going to match these two distributions incorrectly. And if neither of these two convince you, or if you just want to see a cool simulation, we can actually simulate this process end to end. So again, here we have in black, the original, like the Flickr distribution of selection frequencies. In the red, the ImageNet distribution of selection frequencies. And at the bottom here, I'm going to drag a slider, basically, that corresponds to the number of mechanical Turk workers used to measure the selection frequency. So again, more workers means less noise, less workers means more noise. And so this works, yeah, it works. You can basically see that if you use very, very few workers, the resulting ImageNet-v2 selection frequency distribution, which is shown in blue, is actually much closer to the original Flickr distribution than it is to the ImageNet-v1 distribution. And as you use more and more workers, you get closer and closer to actually matching the ImageNet V1 distribution. And this is essentially the driving factor of the bias that we're identifying. It's that even though you matched these observed distributions, what you actually wanted to match was the true distributions. And because you don't have access to that, if you don't kind of account for not having access to that, you're going to end up always kind of consistently underestimating how easy ImageNet is and overestimating how easy Flickr is. Okay, I'm going to assume by the fact that there are no questions in the chat that I can move on, but please stop me. I can always go back to the slide or the ones before it. Okay, so in the last couple of slides, we dedicated them to basically trying to pin down hypothetically what bias would look like in dataset replication. And we've kind of convinced ourselves through like simulation and a bunch of intuition, and we can actually write down a theoretical model where this bias exists, that this bias is real. So how can we experimentally confirm it in real data? Well, fortunately, when we ran our mechanical Turk experiment, we ran it with 40 workers for each image. So for each image, we have a selection frequency of the form like some number divided by 40. Well, what we can do is we can actually artificially vary the number of workers per image that we use in our mechanical Turk experiment. So we can, like, for example, pretend that we only sampled 10 workers, and we can randomly delete 30 workers for each image. And we can observe the effect that this deletion has on various statistics, basically, of ImageNet and ImageNet-v2. So here I have a graph. On the x-axis, again, I just have selection frequency, the observed selection frequency. On the y-axis is density. And essentially what this is showing is that there's kind of a consistent, change. The distribution becomes more and more peaky and slanted towards, or like more and more peaky as I increase the number of workers used to calculate each selection frequency. So just to give a little more detail about this graph, you'll notice like the blue line has 6 points because those correspond to like the possible selection frequencies that you can get using 5 annotators, 0 out of 5, 1 out of 5, 2 out of 5, all the way to 1. Similarly, like the red line has 41 dots because those correspond to the possible selection frequencies you can get with 40 annotators. And what we're plotting here is basically just the density of observed selection frequencies as you vary the number of workers. And the fact that this trend is kind of consistent, like as you increase the number of workers, you see a consistent change in the shape of the distribution, indicates that the statistical bias is actually happening in this data. We can do a similar thing. We can do a similar thing for looking at model accuracies now, conditioned on selection frequencies. So what this looks like, I'll explain this graph again. So on the x-axis, now we have still observed selection frequency, but on the y-axis, we basically have the average accuracy of ResNet-26 on images of that selection frequency. So just for example, like the leftmost blue dot corresponds to if I used 5 annotators to measure all of my selection frequencies, and then I looked at just the images whose selection frequency was measured as 0 out of 5, what is the accuracy of a ResNet-26 on those images? And we can see again the same kind of consistent trend where as I increase the number of workers, we noticed that we were consistently underestimating the accuracy in like the high selection frequency regime and overestimating the accuracy in the low selection frequency regime. So like when I used 5 workers, we thought that images with selection frequency 0 could have accuracy like almost 0.15. But when we kind of use 40 workers to actually measure all the selection frequencies, we realized that the accuracy for selection frequencies close to 0 is actually pretty close to 0, as we'd expect. And similarly, at the very high selection frequency regime, the inverse effect happens. Okay, so we've now noticed, I guess, in the last two graphs, this is exactly the kind of statistical bias we were hoping to pin down. We show that as you increase the number of workers, like from a small number to a larger number, you see a consistent change in these, in the trends for both like statistics with respect to accuracy, statistics with respect to histograms. And so the natural question is, how does this observed bias, and obviously if I was consistently like underestimating how easy ImageNet was and overestimating how easy Flickr was, then my resulting V2 data set probably has harder images than it should. So how can we verify this? How can we see that, like, how can we kind of adjust the accuracy that we get on ImageNet-v2 to compensate for the fact that this bias actually exists? Okay, so to do this, we're going to define a metric called adjusted accuracy. And this adjusted accuracy metric is really simple. First, the first step to measuring this is to sample basically a random image from ImageNet-v1. So this is a random image from the original ImageNet test set. Given this random image, we're then going to look at all of the ImageNet-v2 images, all the images from this replication study that have the same true selection frequency. And we're going to look at the average accuracy on those images. So you can think of this as some kind of combination of the two graphs on the previous slide, where basically we sample V2 images, but according to the selection frequencies of V1. And then we measure accuracy like that. Yeah, so what this should measure is essentially what would the ImageNet-v2 accuracy be if the selection frequencies distributions exactly matched. So if I sampled ImageNet-v2 according to the selection frequency of ImageNet-v1. And so what we can do is we can do this same artificial process where we vary the number of annotators we use. And we see that even within our own data, so with no problems with respect like experimental reproducibility, using more and more workers actually tends to move the adjusted accuracy further and further up. So what this means is that using any finite number of workers, we're probably underestimating this, this adjusted accuracy of ImageNet-v2. So again, just to kind of talk in a little more detail about the graph, this is exactly the same graph that we showed before, where on the x-axis is ImageNet-v1 accuracy. On the y-axis is this adjusted ImageNet-v2 accuracy. And the dotted line is the line y equals x. And then each like little dot in this graph corresponds in the scatter plot corresponds to a model. And so I guess the important thing that I forgot to mention is we can't actually perfectly calculate this adjusted accuracy. So when I say S here, this should really be S hat, because the idea is that I'm just going to use whatever observed selection frequency I really have. Yeah, so again, like with 5 workers, the process here would exactly be, I sample a random ImageNet image, I observe that it has selection frequency like 1 out of 5. I look at all of the ImageNet-v2 images with the same 1 out of 5 selection frequency, and I look at their average accuracy, and then I repeat this process, randomly sampling from ImageNet-v1 until I get an approximation of this expectation. Okay. So hopefully the takeaway here made sense, with the main takeaway being that we're probably underestimating how good models are on the ImageNet distribution, just due to the fact of this like bias with any finite number of samples. Like the accuracy keeps improving. Okay, so how might we actually account for this bias? So how can we get a really like a good estimate of how well ImageNet models should actually be doing on ImageNet-v2 if the distribution's matched? So I guess just to recap, what we've already shown is that like the distribution selection frequencies don't match according to our experiment, even if you match them with like even if you kind of remove all sort like any experimental consistency problems. So selection frequencies don't match, and that this can be attributed in part, at least, to this consistent statistical bias that we're observing. And moreover, we found that the statistical bias actually causes us to underestimate models' accuracy on ImageNet-v2. So how might we kind of calculate an adjusted ImageNet-v2 accuracy? We consider a couple of different ways in our paper, and I'm happy to talk about any of them offline. For now, I'll just discuss one of the ways in which we do it, which is called the Beta-binomial model. And I'll discuss this pretty briefly and then jump to the actual results that we find from doing this adjustment. So recall from like the last slide that we had this adjusted accuracy metric, which is what we cared about, which is on the left here, which is basically what would the accuracy of ImageNet-v2 be if I sampled selection frequencies according to ImageNet-v1. On the right here, I've just written this in an alternate way. So I've expanded this expectation into an integral. So now we're taking an integral over all possible selection frequencies and integrating with respect to like the P of S, which is like the density of true selection frequencies for ImageNet-v1. So I really haven't done anything special here, just expanded the expectation into an integral. Okay, so the problem that we had in the last slide, which I discussed briefly, was that we don't actually have the true selection frequency for any image. We just have this like observed selection frequency. And what we did in the last slide with like the graph with a bunch of lines is that we just plugged in this S hat of X instead of S of X and said like, okay, we already know that this is going to induce the same kind of bias, but this is a good like lower bound on how good ImageNet-v2 should be. So the question here is there a smarter way to estimate what this adjusted accuracy should be without having to plug in S hat of X instead of S of X, which we already know causes bias? Okay, so the main idea behind the Beta-binomial model is instead of trying to actually calculate these two terms here, this like P, I don't know if I can draw here, but this like instead of trying to actually calculate these two terms empirically with the observed data, we're just going to parameterize them as like G of theta of S and P of theta of S. And then we're going to try to find parameters theta. We're going to try to find parameters theta that essentially explain the data we actually observe. So to make this a little more concrete, let's not worry about G theta of S for now because it's a little more complicated. But in terms of P theta of S, P theta of S corresponds to like the density of true selection frequencies. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask basically within some model class, so we'll define a priori, which model in this model class best explains the actual S hats that I observe. So for the model class, we use a mixture of beta distributions, but the actual, like what we're actually going to exploit is this identity here, which basically says that if I knew what my distribution of S's were, there's like a very easy formula that I could use, which is just like convolution with the binomial variable, but like there's a very easy formula that I can use to find what the distribution of observed data I should have is. So concretely, this like P of S hat is known. It's just like the actual histogram that we observe made out of the S hats. Similarly, like given some S, the probability of observing some S hat is really well known because it's just the binomial function. Like you have some true probability, you have a number of trials, which is the number of annotators, and then the number of successes is just just S hat. And so we can really easily calculate the probability of observing an S hat given an S. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to find the theta in this equation that maximizes the likelihood of the S hats that we actually observe. And the actual technique that we use to do this is called beta-binomial regression, along with like the expectation maximization algorithm. But the algorithmic details are not as important as like as kind of the spirit of the algorithm, which is just I'm going to ignore my PSs as a way to compute attributes of my data, and instead I'm just going to use them to infer what the true distribution over S's was, and I'm going to plug that in instead. And yeah, as always, I'm happy to answer questions about that now or offline or at any point in time. Cool. So yeah, so as an example of this, I guess a visual example of this, the green line here is exactly the histogram that we observed like 2 slides ago. So it is with 40 workers, we plot a histogram of like how often we see each observed selection frequency. And now the blue line, the blue dotted line, is the actual P of true S that we observe. And then the the orange line is then, if the blue line were my true P of S, what would I expect to observe? And you can see that these are pretty matched up, but importantly, you can see that like the blue line is not at all the same as the green line, which is what I would have used in my like, if I were just plugging in S hat instead of S. Okay, so now I'll now move ahead to the actual results. What actually results from using this process. So here I have the same graph that we've seen a couple of times now in this presentation, where on the x-axis we have ImageNet-v1 accuracy. Each dot is a model. On the y-axis, we have ImageNet-v2 accuracy. And the orange line is essentially the line that's found in the original paper of like Recht et al. So it's exactly like, without doing any adjustment, what is the raw accuracy on ImageNet-v2. And now the blue line corresponds to what do we compute this adjusted accuracy to be using the Beta-binomial model that I just discussed in the last slide. And so what we find is that instead of observing like an 11 to 14% drop across models, we observe an average drop between ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 of 3.6%, which is obviously much smaller. And so what this suggests is that a large part of the gap between ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 might actually be attributable to an actual change in selection frequency rather than a brittleness to some kind of like unimportant artifact of how the data set was collected or the things we were worrying about earlier. So this is overall, I guess, somewhat good news, but it moreover, more than being good news, it kind of highlights the importance of statistical modeling in data set reproduction studies. So it really shows that like, especially in these like high variance regimes that we're in, like where we can't afford to use like 1,000 workers per image or 1,000,000 workers per image just due to money. It shows that in these high variance regimes, statistical modeling can be a really useful tool for ensuring that we don't end up reading out skewed results due to statistical bias. So there's a bunch of future work that I think is kind of a natural step forward from this. The first of these, which I think forgot to put on the slide, so I'll say it before I show the rest of these, is we still, even after accounting for this statistical bias with our Beta-binomial model and our other strategies that we use in our paper, we still get like 3 to 4%, a 3 to 4% drop between ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2. So an important step forward is trying to actually characterize this drop. Like, what does it come from? Is it actually experimental differences? Could it be distribution shift? There are a bunch of likely candidates, and an important direction for future work is to actually nail down like what exactly are our models not robust to. Beyond this, we might ask, okay, we've shown that perhaps the drop in selection frequency between ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 is, the drop in accuracy between ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 is at least partially attributable to selection frequency, but ideally we want models in the real world that are even robust to changes in selection frequency. So this is kind of outside of the realm of dataset replication, which is what our focus was here. But how can we make sure that our models are robust to even like changes in distribution? Secondly, how can we avoid bias in replication studies a priori? So here we explored a popular data set reproduction. We showed that it had bias, and then we explored various ways of like mitigating this bias in a kind of post hoc way. So a natural question is, how can we actually avoid this, this bias while we're doing the replication studies? And this is still kind of an open question that we have some ideas towards, but nothing super concrete yet. And finally, like this statistical bias due to noisy readings of like data set metrics is just one kind of bias that our the data replication pipeline incurs, and in general that data set pipelines incur. One can imagine many other different biases arising from all sorts of spots in the data pipeline, and we actually have follow-up work along this front that potentially will be presented at MIT, but I'm forgetting now, that basically explores the bias now, not due to like statistical properties, but instead due to the actual experimental setup of how ImageNet was collected. So I'm happy to talk about that offline as well. But yeah, that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Andrew, for the great talk. Does anyone have any question?
Oh, okay, yeah, I just got a question over chat, so I'll read it just in case it helps for the recording. So the question is, we started by talking about the concerns of overfitting to the finite sample data set, and it sounds like we don't have evidence of that for ImageNet. Would I agree? I would say yes, I agree with the premise that we do not have evidence of this overfitting for ImageNet. I guess I wouldn't I wouldn't quite agree that we have evidence that it doesn't happen, but I would definitely agree that we don't have evidence it happens. I think that yeah, I think that like we probably would need further studies to understand whether like I think based on this data we don't have evidence that it happens, and that's what we were looking for. But it's possible that like some other study will come out and find that it does happen in some other way.
Hi, Andrew. This is Philip. Thanks for the really nice talk. So I was just wondering if all the work on ImageNet-v2 was necessary, or if there might be simpler ways of creating an ImageNet-v2 via just resampling the full ImageNet. So what does performance look like, for example, if you just take all of ImageNet and sample a test set at random, IAD from that distribution? And is
like the entire ImageNet test set outside of not just the challenge part?
Yeah, or maybe I missed a detail, but was the careful way of selecting the ImageNet test set applied to both the training set and the test set, or only to the test set, only to the challenge test set?
So the process of like this majority vote process was applied to make the ImageNet test set.
Okay, but not actually the training set.
Yeah, I think the training set was collected in a slightly different way.
I see. Okay, so you can't just resample from the training set and get the same distribution.
Yeah, yeah. So we have like some follow-up work that we're working on now. That yeah, I'd actually be happy to discuss it offline as well about like what does resampling from the training set look like and what are the distributional differences there. But I guess if you want to do like a really proper draw from the same distribution replication study, then like resampling from the training set isn't quite there.
I see. And then maybe one more follow-up question on that. Are there data sets? Presumably there are data sets where the test set was created by just a random sample from a much bigger collection, and we could take a new random sample from that same collection so that we exactly replicate the distribution, so that the V2 test set and the V1 test set are really IAD with respect to each other. Have people looked at those kinds of data sets and whether we still see overfitting?
Yeah, so we have some experiments on them that are obviously not in a paper yet, but the most relevant example that's actually published is for MNIST, which I guess is not like the greatest computer vision data set for like looking at complex phenomena, but basically there's this paper that we cite here that I can also send you. I think it's called like Cold Case or something like that, where they basically find like 50,000 MNIST images that no one has ever trained on or tested on before because they were like not scraped originally from the NIST data set or something, or from like the USPS data set. And they basically find similar, they find a very, very, very small drop in accuracy. Like it's not at all as big as this, but the problem again is that it's MNIST, so it's unclear what kind of drop we should actually be expecting.
I see, cool. Yeah, very interesting. Thanks.
Andrew, so I wanted to ask regarding like whether your work can inform in better ways of collecting, replicating data sets. So I guess that in your case to train your beta models, you're using the setup where you were using like the maximum amount of workers. Can we learn something from the like success rate of the different images so that different images have a different amount of workers, or can we know about how many workers we should use on the collection process to mitigate these biases?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one thing, so about the beta-binomial model that we're proposing, you can actually get it to work with like varying workers per image and all of that stuff, because it's just learning like it's fitting a log likelihood. So the samples are like you can calculate the log likelihood of each sample separately. In terms of dynamically allocating workers, the original ImageNet paper claimed that they had some algorithm for dynamically allocating the number of workers, but they don't like fully specify what that algorithm was, so it makes it hard to replicate. And we haven't really thought about, like, I think it's definitely a good research direction, but we haven't thought about it a lot about how to dynamically allocate workers for the sake of reducing this bias. But it seems like in principle something we could do.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting, and the efforts that you put in. I have a question that is related to what would be the implication of your work for real world application, like in the wild, for instance, when you want to train your model and then use it on some robotics applications and send it to the wild. Let's say in the best case scenario, we can match sort of distributions of the ImageNet. Would it be more like anything that looks like ImageNet, I can work on it, but anything other than that is not my expertise? Like, for instance, you go to a doctor and for your eyes, and like an optometrist, and they would say, well, this is more like cornea problem. That's not my specialty. So my question is, if we train models on these benchmarks that are quite aligned with ImageNet, are we going to the direction that is a good test for ImageNet, or can we actually generalize for real world applications? Does it make sense?
Let me try to rephrase it, and then you tell me if I understood the question correctly. Or like, let me try to answer it, and just let me know if I didn't properly answer the question.
Sure.
So the idea here is that there's definitely a drop between this ImageNet-v1 and ImageNet-v2 data set. And in the wild, we want models that are not just performant on like the exact distributions that we train and test them on. But the purpose of our work is not to, like, we're not trying to claim that like, oh, models are perfectly robust and we should go deploy them. They're clearly not. But the question is, how can we basically distinguish, or how can we distill away drops due to, like, how can we understand this drop better? So before, I guess, like before we do all this stuff, we might think that like models are very robust to, like, we might just say models are not robust and there's like a giant drop and we have no idea where this giant drop comes from. So the steps that we're trying to take are to say, okay, well, we can quantify the drop and say this much is actually due to this actual thing that we can measure called selection frequency. And we can kind of parameterize the we can parameterize the drop along all these metrics that we can kind of intuit about and understand, rather than just saying like there's a giant drop and we don't know why it happens.
Yeah, that's great. I get that part. So my question was more like, have you thought about what can we learn from all of the work that you did to generalize for the case where we are dealing with the real world applications or data? It's kind of complementary to what you have been doing and your kind of question.
Yeah, so I think maybe a general thing that you can apply to like real world data is a really powerful tool here was essentially parameterizing the data along some metric that we understand. So for example, like the selection frequency metric, and like you can think like I'm guessing that you can think of like other metrics for other data sets that might make more sense than selection frequency. And the idea is that by looking at differences and biases and all of this stuff along the axis of these metrics, we can like better understand where distribution shift comes from in the real world, like on data sets, on like real data sets that are not just perfectly matched ImageNet.
All right, cool, thank you.
Right. Thank you again, Andrew, for the talk. It was great hearing about it. And if people want to follow up, feel free to shoot him an email. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.